Hi, everyone. Now, this is David Roche from Independent Strategy and Quantum Economics. I wanted to talk to you today about China and in particular about the summit of the Chinese Communist Party and the twin meetings coming up in March and what they actually mean. I want to make 7 points and then draw a couple of conclusions. The first is that the China COVID policy, while in the historical perspective may be only for the medium term, is a part of Xi Jinping thought. It is a part of the ideology, and it is not going to be stepped down anytime soon. There are, of course, economic reasons behind it, in that the number of emergency intensive care hospital beds in China would be incapable of coping with a wave of serious infections among the elderly who remain, relative to other countries in the world, very unvaccinated with low vaccination rates. The second is that the new global economic disorder, which we have been going on about for nearly 3 or 4 years now, is set to stay. And what it means is that the world divides up into 3 mutually detesting blocks. First of all comes the authoritarian states of China and Russia with their few and far between allies. Then the liberal democracies, led by the United States and Europe. And then there are the vast and different emerging market states like India and Brazil, who do not have any ethical or moral content to their foreign policy, or which bloc they want to be in, other than their economic advantage. The third point is Taiwan. This conference promoted the Taiwan issue to being part of the Constitution. Xi has made it quite clear that if he can't deal with Taiwan politically, he'll deal with it militarily. We think a military confrontation will happen within the next 5 to 7 years. It could take the form of a blockade. It can take the form of cyber warfare, pinpoint attacks on key assets like Taiwanese semiconductor, or a mixture of all of those things and a seaborne invasion. The point one should bear in mind is that sanctions against Russia have done enormous damage and will do more. But Russia is only a producer of commodities and energy. China is a producer of practically everything that is integrated into global consumer markets, and its economy is highly dependent on global consumer markets, as well as to a lesser extent than in the past on investment markets and things like 5G and so on. Now that raises a two-way vulnerability. If China was to do something unacceptable about Taiwan, its economy is highly vulnerable. It could drop by at least 10% if embargoes were put on its consumer goods. The second is that, of course, the West would endure big damage from sanctions imposed on China, because there are no substitutes for iPhones unless you home base, friendshore, onshore all of the 70% of smartphones that are made in China. But I've no doubt about it that if it came to war with Taiwan, we would all be extremely surprised by what sacrifices the West is prepared to make and what losses economically would surprise China. The fourth is the legacy problem of over-leverage in China, which involves bad lending, bad assets, which weigh on the economic activity and will weigh, although these liabilities were incurred in the past, they will weigh on the future because they have never been written down to their true value and the losses really taken on board, which is the only way to deal with an asset inflation and an over-leverage problem. This is connected to the next point, which is property development, which probably supplied 30 to 50% of Chinese growth over the last decades. It supplied a considerably greater percent of the happiness of citizens who own 80% of their houses because they made money every year out of having fixed mortgages and increasing property prices. And this set up a merry-go-round whereby people could, in particular and developers, could borrow against existing houses to invest in future houses. It will come as a surprise to you that given Chinese demography, the number of houses per capita in China is now almost equal to the number of houses per capita in Japan before it had its property bust. So the idea that in some way or another China is short of houses is completely wrong. What is absolutely key is that it is over-leveraged throughout the whole property sector. This sector cannot repeat the miracle growth which gave people satisfaction and rising living standards for 20 years. Therefore, one must ask, what will? Common prosperity? Probably not, as it takes away from the rich entrepreneurial creative sector of the economy and redistributes it to the average citizen, which is not morally a bad thing to do. Certainly the West is no example when it comes to income and wealth inequality, but it is not something that spurs growth. Linked to this is the rebirth of the state-owned enterprise as commanding the dominant heights of the economy. If you look at the statistics for China, the decline in the state-owned enterprise sector came to a halt with Deng Xiaoping, and it has been increasing in recent years in line with Xi's ideology that the economy must follow the party and not vice versa. Now that is all very good. I'm not personally greatly enamored with people like Musk and Google taking over the world. But I have to say that I think state-owned enterprises taking over the world is a lot worse. These are not productive enterprises. In fact, if you look at them, they're mainly at the back end of the supply chain, making things like steel and concrete, distributing iron ore and coal, making electricity. But these are fine, but they are not the sort of industries which are going to drive a highly productive, fast-growing China. On the contrary, they are part and parcel of the productivity problem of China, where not only the productivity of labor, but the productivity of capital has been falling for years. Unless that is reversed, China cannot reverse the course of its economic relative growth decline. The final point I think one has to bear in mind is demography. The reason why demography is so important is this. If you go back to the miracle years of Chinese growth, the demography which backed it was that two working parents had one child. Now the working parents have reached retirement age and gone beyond it. And the one child is left working, supporting two non-economically active people. The effect of that demography is to immediately drop your potential growth rate. Old age people do not spend and invest in the same way as young people in their 30s or 40s. So what actually happens is productivity falls and the growth rate of the economy declines unless something dramatic is done to boost productivity per capita of a rapidly aging and increasingly economically inactive economy. I will add one anecdote to this. If you actually look at who is having children in China, a very interesting statistic pops up. And that is, the more educated a woman is, the less children she wants to have and the less children she has. And the reason for that is if she had the children, it would take her out of the economic secretary. The money she earns for being well educated would evaporate, and bringing up children is horribly expensive. So essentially, the higher the trained working force, the lower the chances of them having a family, and the lower the chance of that family ever contributing to the future growth of China. What is really interesting is that in the economic summit, this, which I would say is the most important of China's 7 long-term sorrows, was not addressed at all. It was as if it didn't exist. That tells me how economically motivated and structured China's government is. The 2 people who could have been considered to be moderate economic reformers were actually dropped from the Standing Committee and the Politburo, and their place was taken by people who are categorized mainly by their loyalty to President Xi, rather than by their economic experience or track record. What does this mean? It means that the world is splitting into 3 blocks, rivaling each other in ways which are economically quite unproductive, but are intended to produce greater stability for each of the blocks, deepening their ideological differences is set to deepen further. There will probably, I would say, between 5 and 7 years, be a major conflict about Taiwan. And there will be crises, kind of a preparation by the Chinese PLA, leading into that ultimate crisis. But it will mean that geopolitical tensions in the world will not go down. And the driver of things like markets will become increasingly political and less economic. Don't lose hope. Things can change course. But I think there is a major problem coming up. About how China actually comes to grow. It will have to be domestically driven. And because it is domestically driven, it will be, I suspect, increasingly isolationist and less productive. Goodbye, good night, and don't forget to turn the lights off.